finishing their last cup of coffee. Well, let's open with prayer. Father, I thank you that today we can come here, that we can find that place away from the noise, the challenges, and the stresses of all that goes on outside these walls. Lord, even that we were able to come here and to move away from the storm that's literally been going on around us. Lord, help us now as we talk about the storm that goes on inside of us. Help us to just think through how you want us to walk in these days when externals like to take over and destroy our internals. And give me words and wisdom to communicate what you have given me to communicate. Thank you that we do not walk this journey alone. Amen. So when Robert asked me to do a seminar for this event, it's always a challenge to think of what do you say to pastors, pastors' wives, people in ministry. And all I could think of was at this time, this has been a unique year. It's been a unique year for everybody, but I think it's also put added pressure on those in ministry. So, and I just thought about life at Keswick and what we have personally been going through and all of the challenges that we've had to meet, and just pretty much making the assumption, although I know that's dangerous, that pastors and others in ministry have been going through the same challenges and feeling the effects. So I entitled this COVID Burnout and Pandemic Fatigue. Probably everybody understands what that means, but I'm going to go just talk a little bit about those two terms. Burnout impacts is those of us who serve in ministry, academics, or any kind of charitable work. And in these days, it's affecting businesses in ways that it never has before. We love what we do. It's why we do what we do. We love those we serve. That's what keeps us going, sometimes when the going gets tough. And we answer to God's call. We follow in what God has led and where he has directed us. For the most part, we are all trained, experienced, and well-resourced. That's who we are going into this whole event. But let me give you some pre-COVID statistics about those of us in ministry. Now, this is a brand new statistics, came out just before COVID hit. So we are really talking pre-pandemic. They had no idea when they revised these statistics that they were probably going to have to do a whole new set afterwards. I'm just going to highlight the ones that I think really pertain. 72% of pastors report working between 55 and 75 hours a week. 84% of pastors feel they're on call 24/7. 80% believe ministry has affected their families, negatively affected their families. 65% of pastors feel their family lives in a glass house and fear they're not good enough to meet expectations. 66% of church members expect a minister and their family to live at higher moral standards. 90% of pastors report that ministry was completely different than what they thought it would be. And 53% of pastors are concerned about their future and financial security. 75% of pastors report significant stress-related crisis in their ministry, 75% before COVID. 80% of pastors expect conflict within their church. 70% of pastors report they have a lower self-image than when they first started in ministry. 27% of pastors report not having anyone to turn to in a crisis situation. 57% of pastors feel fulfilled yet discouraged, stressed, and fatigued. 84% of pastors desire to have a close fellowship with someone they can trust and they can confide in. And that's just a spattering. I think of the ones that set up poor statistics going into COVID. And that we know that fatigue and stress and being unappreciated goes, and the job is heavy on our souls. But burnout is nothing new. The Apostle Paul wrote in Corinthians 1:8, he wrote of being so utterly burdened beyond his strength that he despaired of life itself. In 2 Corinthians 11:28, he said, the daily pressure on me of my anxiety for the church. St. Augustine wrestled with despair, and he called it sin. Luther was well known for his melancholy and his then OCD. And Charles Spurgeon wrote knowingly of the minister's fainting fits. Nothing new under the sun. More than most environments, ministry combines what we do, our work, with what we believe, our faith, with our community, and that means our congregation and our friends. Our work, our faith, and our community all come under the same umbrella. And so without skillful navigation, we ride a roller coaster of emotions in ministry that often push us towards burnout. Anybody here never experienced like that feeling of I'm done? Can't go? Do I have to get up today? Do I even have to go preach this sermon? And or that thought of I'm be good today as long as I don't run into that certain member of your congregation that you just go, how long, oh Lord, how long? There are many reasons for stress and burnout. I'm going to give you some, and I'm going to compare how they are even more impacted with COVID. The disparity between the idealistic expectations and the reality. That's what happens in ministry. We go into it having this great idea of what it's going to look like, and it really kind of looks a lot different than what we expected. Here's the COVID reality. We went into this last March with one expectation. It is constantly changing. We don't even know where our expectations are to lie. So there's a definite disparity even between our day-to-day now and what we thought this year was going to look like and what this year actually, or these who knows how many, year and a half or so is going to look like. Burnout comes when we have a lack of defined boundaries. Our boundaries are changing every other day in COVID, from what looked like in March and then spring and then fall. We really don't know what's coming around the block or how to prepare. Conflict in being a leader, trying to please everyone. I know alone at Barbara's Place, it's trying to make everybody happy and kind of give them the experience they're looking for and living within boundaries that are set for us or the safety that we need to have. And so it is really hard to please everybody in COVID, and I'm going to guess in your churches you have very differing views on how we should be walking through this. Trying to be a servant to everybody. If COVID hasn't done anything, volunteers were always at a minimum in churches. Now volunteers are scared, sick, can't come. So oftentimes that means the leaders are carrying all of the weight. Inability to produce a win-win situation. We have no power or control over COVID. We can't produce anything with it but perseverance. Changing expectations and rules. Certainly, we already talked about that. That is going on in COVID. Working too hard and without a break. Most leaders right now are carrying more tasks than they ever had to carry before. For a lot of different reasons. Reaching a goal after a long, hard work and not having a vision or a purpose to go forward. I think COVID has kind of killed all of the goals and visions and dreams that we had, so we are left back at where are we? There's a lot of research on it's not going to look the same at the other side, so what do we do with our old goals? And that's exhausting. If you think of all the energy you put in to create the goals for where you were going and then find out none of those are going to probably happen and you have to fully revamp, that's exhausting mentally and emotionally. Feeling betrayed by those you're serving. Maybe you decide this is the way it's going to go down and everybody's yelling and screaming at you. Having done all you can but not really moving forward. That's what we call a sense of stuckness. Whenever we feel stuck or we've come against a wall, burnout and fatigue is inevitable. Failure of a project or ministry in which you invested yourself heavily. We're going to talk about, that's the aftermath of COVID. Frustration with others, policies, choices, and cooperation. Certainly in COVID, we have a lot of frustrations. And I mean, maybe I'm speaking just for myself, but there's a lot of frustrations with others, policies, decision-making, and how it involves us. We already talked about unfulfilled expectations, lack of focus. Energies and activities are scattered in too many different directions. Trying to do the job you weren't called to do, gifted or trained to do. Zoom and technology. Live streaming for so many. I know in the beginning we've taken that on and we're doing Zoom classes with grads, we're doing Zoom things, I'm doing podcasts. I mean, all these things that were not in my frame of reference before. And we end up in over our heads without adequate support, and that might even come in the realm of technology. So COVID has taken every single one of the standard components of burnout and fatigue and probably escalated them or thrown them all in one big pot. So symptoms. Frequent illnesses, sleep problems, disillusionment, cynicism, detachment, absenteeism, harshness. I put here a burnout survey. There is a great one. There's a survey called the Professional Quality of Life Scale Survey. It's, you can find it online if you look it up. You can take this survey. It's statistically based, kind of find out where your compassion and serving fatigue really is, but how do you know if you're headed towards burnout, or how do you know if this is what you're dealing with? Your motivation has faded. The passion that fueled you is gone. Your motivation is either vaporized or it's, kind of like, my motivation is just to get through the day. Restlessness. Nothing seems settled. There's no place you can just sit down and feel like it's just quiet. You're disconnected from your inner identity and calling. You're at the mercy of other people's expectations or your own compulsions. Your main emotion is numbness. You no longer feel the ebbs and flows, the highs and lows, the joys of ministry. That would be like, how was your day? You don't come home and you don't say, oh, today was a great day. I mean, there's probably some of them, but you don't, usually when you end up burnout, those, you just don't feel them the same way. People drain you. People always drain us. People drain us on our best days. But burnout means we have few people because more and more are draining us of our energy. Little things make you disproportionately angry. When you start losing your cool over the small things, it's signs something is very wrong. If you found yourself to just be a little bit more irritable, or you bite back a little more, or, a very small, spilt milk is now a major calamity. That's a sign of burnout. You're becoming cynical. Cynicism rarely finds a home in a healthy heart. And this is certainly the day and age of cynicism. Your productivity is dropping because you're losing focus. I know there's on good days I'll go in and say, I'm going to go and I'm going to isolate and I'm going to just do this work and get this done. And I come out and I'm like, man, I used to be able to accomplish so much more in that amount of time, but it's not happening anymore. What used to take you 5 minutes now takes you 45 minutes. You're self-medicating. Your coping mechanism has gone underground. So many self-medication is, believe it or not, more work, which just spirals downhill. Maybe I'll just work harder. Maybe I'll just push through. Escapist behavior. You choose life-draining activities to relax. Facebook, social media, conspiracy theories, getting involved in political arguments, running the cultural waves and getting involved in the COVID drama. Believe it or not, trying to make others happy, working harder to make other people happy is just never really energizing. You don't laugh anymore. Nothing seems funny or fun. And at worst, you begin to resent people. Sleep and time off no longer refuel you. Maybe you even get a great night's sleep, but you wake up in the morning, you're still tired. Maybe you've taken a vacation. I actually managed to get a few of them in, and I remember coming back thinking, I don't even feel like I went on vacation. You stop taking care of yourself. You cut the corners of your own personal life, sleeping, eating, taking care of yourself physically, exercising, although, is your name Bill, was over here exercising, so he gets the prize. Participating in your hobby. It's interesting, when we start burnout, that's one of the first things that we cut out, are the things that are our outlets. We hoard our energy. How do you hoard energy? You basically engage in you engage in relationships that take a lot of energy, so you stop having any relationships. So you stop, because one is too much, you stop relationships altogether because you just can't expend any more energy, even if it's good, life-giving energy. And unfortunately, in ministry, we slip in our own personal spiritual practices. We study only to teach or to preach, not for personal growth and relationship. Now, you take these 16 or 15, and if you've identified with even a few of these, you might be on your way to burnout or in it. If you have half of them, you're like, oh yeah, I can relate to that. You might be very, very close to going over the cliff. If you've identified with most or all, well, you probably are in a good full-blown state of COVID burnout or ministry burnout, but we'll blame it all on COVID right now. So for ministry leaders, and that's what I use because I know everybody has different roles in ministry here, COVID burnout and pandemic fatigue turns into personal burnout and compassion fatigue. Because that's what we do in ministry. We're about compassion. Because in compassion fatigue, we have absorbed too much of the trauma and emotional stresses of others. We have symptoms similar to burnout, but it usually happens faster. Where burnout is subtle, happens over time, and you never mean for it to happen. You have feelings of being ineffective, callous, negative, sarcastic, and stuck. And if you're from New Jersey, your sarcasm has risen to the top. See, in the middle of COVID, the thing we want to give, which is why we went into ministry in the first place, a deep, sincere compassion towards others in their time of need, runs dry. We want to help, but we can only take so much suffering. And we become victims of our own giving. Because I wrote here, it's hard to be the hope giver when it's hard to be hopeful yourself. Compassion burnout is a reality of ministry life because we are finite and fallen creatures. Someone who works a lot with those that are suffering, in pain, stories over and over again. Those of us that do counseling for a living, not just in pieces, know what it's like sometimes to carry too much of other people's stuff. And what COVID has done is we're not just carrying other people's stuff, we're trying to fix other people's stuff, we're trying to navigate the world's stuff, and we're trying to deal with our own stuff at the same time. So compassion becomes something that took us into the ministry, but at this point could destroy us, and we lost it. Compassion is, I think, the key to what we do. Compassion comes from the Latin words which pate and cum, which means to suffer with. In the English, it has tons and tons of weight because it is actually, compassion is an attribute of God. It's part of being Christ-like, and it's certainly the metaphor for ministry. Theologian Andrew Purves writes, "A case can be made for seeing compassion as the center of pastoral care. Compassion makes caring specific. Compassion radicalizes caring, giving our caring root in the deepest places of God's being." Henry Nouwen, if you've ever read his books, he's a great author, especially in these days to read, says, "Compassion asks us to go where it hurts, to enter into places of pain, to share into brokenness, fear, confusion, and anguish. Compassion challenges us to cry out with those in misery, to mourn with those who are lonely, to weep with those in tears. Compassion requires us to be weak with the weak, vulnerable with the vulnerable, and powerless with the powerless. Compassion means full immersion in the condition of being human." We were made in the image of a compassionate God. And we are in turn called to show that compassion as ministers of His to others. He, God, has always used ministry and ministers to show God's compassion. However, again, compassion becomes almost impossible when we ourselves are the walking wounded. And it's difficult to offer compassion otherwise. So what is God calling us to if He totally understands that? I mean, Jesus walked in this world and He was full of compassion, and He was in a very broken world with a whole lot of stuff that most of us would not really want to be walking in. And what Jesus' followers did is they followed Him because He trained them to learn that His yoke is easy in the middle of doing the hard things. He came and taught how to walk and navigate compassion and caring and healing without it changing who He was. So right now, in the middle of COVID, when COVID and ministry mixes in a very toxic kind of way or explosive way at times, He's inviting us to train again with Him. Matthew 11:28-30 is one of the verses we love to quote at Barbara's Place. And this is a unique version, but I'm going to read it. It says, "I see how tired you are." Imagine Jesus saying this to you right now. "I have a tender heart for you. Come get into the grace yoke with me. Let's pull the plow across the field together so we can harvest the crops of love and peace to feed hungry people. Walk in step with me and we'll get the work done in a good and delightful way. Join me and your soul will really come alive in God's spiritual world." Should try reading Matthew 11:28 through 30 in a bunch of different versions and find the version that God is literally speaking to exactly where you are. Uses your words to invite you out of the chaos of ministry and the running around and the proving and the making everybody happy and making it all work and making sure the programs still get done, and rest in him. How do we learn the easy yoke of Jesus? Well, the way to restore compassion for others is by receiving and savoring the compassion of God towards us. God has an inward solution to a very outward struggle. And I would get here in preparing this, and I was even thinking about how many things got in the way of even getting this prepared, including a snowstorm and power outage, and all your notes are now in technology, and you have a power outage and the cable goes out, and you're like, how do I prepare? How do I take all that? And I went to somebody and said, back in the day, it would all be on paper, and this wouldn't be a problem. But today, technology has actually, again, made life harder, more stressful, and complicated. Can't even get to your notes because they're hid away in the cloud. But all I kept thinking is, if I can't find my notes, and if I can't pull this up in the next 24 hours and get it done, I think I would, the bottom line is we have to go back to the basics. COVID is calling us individually back to the basics. 2020 we were revved up and going. And so how do we renew? We go back to the basics. That's a hard thing to do when we might be distant from them or there's so many other demands. I think from Matthew 11, very clearly, he says the first thing we need to do is slow down. How many times in the last couple days I'd say, man, Little House on the Prairie. They were already in this situation. None of this that slowed down changed their life in the same way. But we have gotten so that we are so dependent on certain things, certain ways, and all the freedoms that COVID really has had to take us back to the basics. To care for the burdens of others requires slowing down, paying close attention, and not being in a hurry. Hurry is a surefire recipe for ministry burnout. It is an unsustainable pace. Paul talks a lot about running the race that was set before us. I think in ministry we think the race is a 50-yard dash or a 100-yard dash or maybe a 440, and I don't know that much about running. And I don't like to run at all. But in our personal lives, we do a lot of running. And I think God is telling us, ministry for me is a marathon. Everybody wants a short, everybody who comes to us, the women that come to Barbara's Place want us to fix it tomorrow. They want us to come in and they want us to have a magic wand and make it all better. Or they want to come to Jesus and they want to come to God and having not had him in their life at all and think that he's going to all of a sudden make it better. We are all in a hurry for the solution. We're all in a hurry for the quick fix. Isn't that kind of why COVID's really gotten under our skin, because it didn't quickly disappear as fast as it came? Isn't that why we're tired of those things, because we're done with them? It's not, come on, let's just fix this. To cultivate compassion, we must let God redirect our plans. We've got to let go of our timelines, and we have to respond to the suggestions and needs of our people. We need to learn to wait and watch God. Maybe this is our wilderness experience, where God wants to take us back to a quieter relationship with him, where we become dependent totally on him for our next step, for our next direction, for our next goal, for our next what are we going to do today. Slow down. You know, the other day I was sitting in, Barbara's Place thinks it's funny when I get singing, and if you know my husband, you know that he's got a song for everything, so it's kind of 17 years of marriage, I start doing it occasionally. But I just kept thinking, you know, and you're all old enough, you know, slow down, you move too fast. You gotta make the morning last, just kicking down the cobblestones. Well, feeling groovy. So, apparently I can't get that part out. But, you know, think about it. Slow down and you'll feel groovy. Right? Isn't that's like slow down and you'll get your rest back. You'll get your energy back. You'll feel good again. But we don't slow down. So slow down, wait and watch God. Stock the pond. We got to get back into the spiritual disciplines and hope grounding in us. Oftentimes we come running into the season, and because we've been giving so much and not filling, we are now dry cisterns. And there's nothing left to give. And then we get running and we're giving, and we aren't taking the time, we're not slowing down enough to be able to restock ourselves. We really have to get back to the spiritual disciplines. And for the longest time, I mean, I grew up in the church, I had no clue what a spiritual discipline was. Not. Maybe a lost art. In a much deeper sense, the minister of compassion has to return to the well daily, drawing fresh resources from the source of all compassion. We have a never-ending supply, but we need to supply and we need to stock up for those times that require more than we are ready or prepared to give. In scriptures, we find our compassionate Lord speaking to us directly, comforting us, encouraging us, and renewing our souls. We forgot that we have an inner soul that is thirsty. We're pretty good at decorating the outside and forgetting that the inside is starving. Philippians 4:4-7 reminds us that with thanksgiving, we make our requests and the God of peace will be with us. That's the basics. Get back to thanksgiving. I think one of the detriments of COVID is that we have gotten into everything COVID has taken from us, everything that COVID has messed up for us, every way COVID has inconvenienced us. And yet God says, in everything give thanks. So one of the spiritual disciplines really is to stay grounded in thankfulness, to pay attention at God's hand at work in the midst of the wilderness experience. One of the things that I did, and I'm really glad I did it, I'm not sure I knew in the beginning that I'd have to do and that it would help sustain me, but I kept saying that we've got to see the COVID positives. We have to be paying attention to what we're doing that wouldn't have happened or we wouldn't have experienced, or a new thing that God has taught us because of COVID. Not that COVID's ever going to be good, but we can be thankful for what God is doing in the midst of it. The church will look different. I mean, there are studies out there. But the church has not been silent. God has really woken up the church in many ways. And as much as we hate technology, God has really gotten the church out there in the airwaves in an abundance. So how can we be thankful? Philippians, how can we do all things without murmurings and grumblings? Remembering that he will provide all our needs according to his riches in heaven. Prayer, we lay our burdens down. Thought it was interesting that the other seminar going on right now is prayer, when prayer is probably one of the more crucial things that we need to really spend time doing, to hear from God, to listen to what he wants to tell us, to hear from him for direction. And most of all, when all of our people are mad at us and we can't make them happy and we can't fix things, we get God to say to us, I love you. I put you there. I called you for this. And he affirms our role. And he lifts us up. That's lasting. We say if someone says something nice to me one day, I wait for the next day when they have something not so nice to say. But that's not our Lord. When we go to his well, he only wants to fill us and lift us up. So slow down, stock the pond, lead from within. That's true soul care. Psalm 23, I love, maybe that's going back to the basics. Let's go back to Psalm 23. Go back to think about what it really tells us for our day-to-day. Psalm 23 has been hanging in my house my entire life. When I was a baby, my parents got it in calligraphy for my sprinkling, and it still hangs in my house today. I've been looking at it. Here's the problem. If you look at Psalm 23 long enough, forever, you really don't even remember what it says anymore. But listen, when we're fatigued and when we are dry on the outside, we tend to default to our intellect, what we know, and our competency, what we do, and what we can do, or our reputation, what others say we are. But here's what we know. The Lord is our shepherd. I shall not want. That's what we know. Every day, he leads us too. What do we know? He restores my soul. He restores. He doesn't just call me to work and to call me to go do his bidding. He restores my soul. He leads me. COVID does not lead me. People do not lead me. He leads. He provides. One of the things that COVID has done is it's made our future insecure. You know, the rumblings of what's going to happen and are we going to be financially secure and are we going to have money and all that. God says he provides. Our reputation, he says he prepares us a table for us in the presence of our enemies. He's the one that says who we are and that we can withstand that, and he knows, he understands. What we know, what we can do or think we can do, and what others say we are. COVID, in the age of COVID, all three of them have been challenged. What we thought we knew, we're like, I don't know what to do. I don't know. I don't know how many times I said, I don't know in the last 8 to 10 months. Someone will say, what are we going to do about this? I'm like, I don't know. That's not a good feeling sometimes when you're the leader to look at your people and go, oh, got a clue. God does, if we go to him for that answer. Our competency, what we can do. How many times you say, I can't do that. Oh, I don't know how to do that. I can't even go there. But we can, if God leads us there. Or a reputation. God says, we are loved, we are chosen, we are appointed. He sends us, he equips us, he prepares us, not our people, not the size of our congregation, not how warm or cold our building is, not whether or not right now we're having church or not having church, whether or not everybody's back or not back. God prepares and takes care of our reputation and his church. The model of a healthy ministry is to lead from within, who we are in Christ, what we have in Christ. And I'd say most of all that the church is his, it's not ours. when I was researching this, I didn't even really go there, but I'm going to put this line in here because so much of the research on ministry burnout had to do with getting out of our own way, getting rid of our own pride, our own need for reputation, and the need to be liked. That's one of the big things that take people down or destroy. And I think COVID has played on that a whole lot. The compassion of Christ can embrace us, it can transform us, and it can empower us to continue in the ministry of compassion. I think the Psalms, Psalm 23 is another thing that, growing up, I just jumped over them because they made absolutely no sense to me. But more and more in my own personal ministry and in the ministry of meeting others and in my own lives, I have learned the need to walk in a psalmic experience. That we need to learn the art of lament and filling. A new word might be we need to learn to unburden ourselves. To say, God says, cast all your cares on me. Come if you're burdened and I will give you rest. That's what the Psalms do. That is David's example of leading through all kinds of seasons, the highs of his ministry to the lows of his kingship, to the wandering years, to the how long, O Lord. Allow God to meet you internally through David and the Psalms. Psalm 3 especially is a great little psalm that if you read it and just reflected and sat in it and personalized it, maybe change the words of David to fit your situation. The Psalms are filled with hungry heart scriptures and reminders. David, we teach our women at Barbara's Place how to write psalms, and they do a lot of that in and out through Evers, is to be able to come to God and leave our troubles, our feelings, our pains, our frustrations, our questions, our angst at his feet, but not walk away without picking up what he wants to give us in place of what we've had to lay down. Recently doing a study on Nehemiah, and normally whenever I've studied Nehemiah, it's very much about leadership, and it's kind of focused mostly on a leader. This is really sort of for everybody. How do we persevere through difficulties? O.S. Hawkins did this. It's called, I forgot the title of the book. It'll pop into my head. But it's a Nehemiah study, and he says there are ways to persevere, and we can learn through Nehemiah how to persevere through difficulties. He had to go and rebuild the wall. He was called by God to go rebuild the wall. Now his enemies did not want that wall rebuilt. In many ways, I think COVID is a source of the enemy trying to help destroy the church or crumble our motivation. Some of us never get to rebuild in life because we're hit with an opposition. We're prone to quit, fumble away our opportunity, or worse yet, start running in the opposite direction. That's what O.S. Hawkins says. He came up with a term that I think is going to be a really good term for us to think about. Well, he didn't come up with it. He borrowed it from football. It's called yards after contact. Since the Super Bowl's coming up, I thought it was appropriate to throw a little football in here. Yards after contact determines whether or not we're going to reach our goal after we have come across an obstacle. So this is to study how many, whoever has the ball and is running down the field, when he hits his first obstacle, how many yards do they manage to continue on after contact? And of course, a good player can manage a lot more yards after contact. You don't want a player that as soon as they're down. But that's the question. COVID is sort of one of our obstacles in our personal life and in our ministry life. And O.S. Hawkins wrote this pre-pandemic, but I think it fits. Because this is what happens when we hit a conflict. Conflict comes from the outside. I'd call that COVID. It starts destroying our morale. We don't even know why we're doing it anymore. It undergirds our motives, and it does a very good job of trying to kill our mission. So an outside conflict, those are the three areas that the enemy wants to do. He wants to take our morale, our motive, and our mission away. And then I think COVID has done a good job doing that in many, many, many areas of our lives, not just in ministry. And so what happens inside? O.S. Hawkins says, when we run across outside conflict, when we run across COVID, this is what happens on the inside: fatigue, frustration, and failure. Sounds like burnout and compassion fatigue to me. So right in good old Nehemiah faced the same exact things that we did trying to rebuild the wall. Outside conflict that wanted to destroy the morale of the people, so they gave up. It tested the motives of why they were doing what they were doing. And it certainly wanted to stop the building of the wall altogether and destroy the mission. The people became tired. The people became very frustrated. And they basically started saying things like, what's the use, why bother? Or they tried to fix it in a hurry. And I don't know if you know the story, they tried to rebuild with the crumbled walls, and Nehemiah says, no, we have to get the rubble out of the way. And that's a whole nother story. But we have to deal with the conflict, and we have to see the conflict for what it is. And then we have to make proper adjustments. If you've ever done the Experiencing God book, which is a great book, and that certainly talked about facing a huge challenge. One chapter in there, he says, we need to make proper adjustments. That's what Nehemiah did. He adjusted, he redid the plan, and he kept reworking it as needed. In Experiencing God, he'll say, we have to find out where God is working and meet him there, not try to fight against what God's trying to do. Jeremiah 6:16 says, thus saith the Lord, stand in the ways and see. Ask for the old paths where the God way is and walk in it. Then you will find rest for your souls. Make proper adjustments in COVID in ministry. Maybe we have to rethink our goals. Maybe we have to rethink our objectives and what we're actually going to do and how we're going to do it. My word for this year is focus. We got to keep our focus on Jesus and less on the unimportant and not get distracted. Maybe we have to look at our format. Maybe our format has to change. One of the things we've done in Barbara's Place is we've constantly had to make adjustments. Adjustments on the schedule, adjustments with what we did, adjustments with where we went, adjustments with visitation, adjustments with staffing. If I had said I refuse to make any adjustments, we'd all be pulling our hair out right now. So maybe making proper adjustments in the middle of COVID personally is, and then in your ministry, is to ask who, where, when, and how. And you ask that of God. Maybe even, let's not forget the what. You can also Google, and I can give you these references if you want to. There's a pivot-ready cheat sheet out there that has been put together to be ready to do the pivoting as we emerge out of this and what the church is going to look like post-COVID. And that's really what it's all talking about, is be ready to make adjustments and don't be afraid to, even if you come across opposition. Then he says, keep doing what's right. Nehemiah knew what was right. Nehemiah kept and stuck with the task. What do we know is right in the middle of COVID with ministry looking at us? We're to fix our eyes on Jesus. we're to preach the gospel, and we're going to do the one another's. Back to the basics. Do what's right, even if it's not how we were doing it before or how we envisioned doing it. You know, it's a little like the keep it simple, blank. Sometimes that's what we just do, go back to the basics. Make sure we're doing the basics. In step 4, one of our goals in ministry is to rally the troops. Run with hope. Encourage and instill hope. You know, Jeremiah 29:11 is a favorite verse of a lot of people. They love to say, you know, for I know the plans I have for you, plans to prosper you and not to harm you, to give you a future and a hope. That's a great verse. But I always challenge somebody to read all of the verses that come before it. Because all the verses that come before it are our COVID experience. It's our wilderness experience. The Israelites weren't where they wanted to be. They weren't doing what they were wanting to do. They wanted out. They wanted back home. They wanted things back to the way they wanted. And God says, nope, this is where you are. So while you're there, engage, do life, do ministry. There's a hope out there, but it's when I say. And so Jeremiah 29:11 is it really is a good verse for this season. God knows. He knows when it's going to end. He knows why and how long it has to last. He knows what he's doing in the church, and he knows what he wants the church to do. This is not a surprise to him. So it's our job to remember that and to cling to that, but first, doing it inside of ourselves. One of the things that has kind of been interesting as the director of Barbara's Place is looking at lots of different curriculum from a lot of different people and ministries to find the one that speaks. And one of the pastors that I've run across out there in the Midwest actually wrote an article about his season in burnout and what he experienced. And it was mostly based on disappointment and big projects, and then it all kind of fell out, and we kind of run a high, and then we fall off the cliff. So he wrote a list, and I'm going to give you his list. This is now pastor to pastor on how he survived and what he learned from his season of burnout. So he says, Jesus himself had a time out for prayer, meditation, and rest. We have a tendency to do more only to accomplish less, exclamation point. Sounds like what I said there in the beginning is symptoms of burnout. Time management is one of our biggest problems. We burn the candle at both ends. It says, beware of the enemy. Exercise, eat meals, spend time with your family and friends, and develop outside interests. Sounds just like the opposite of what ends up happening when we're in burnout. Before you go into ministry, reflect and reorganize your thoughts. Spend time in prayer and meditation. Celebrate the good. Remember, you are the most important person in your life. You cannot help others unless you take care of yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. Pay attention to your spiritual life. This seems silly to say to ministers, but the reality is we deal with the things of the Lord so relentlessly that we can neglect our own spiritual care. Remember Paul's challenge to the Ephesian elders, take heed to yourselves. Or his counsel to young Pastor Timothy, keep a close watch on yourself. Stay active in whatever form that takes for you. Be honest. You need to tell someone the truth, ugly or beautiful. He says, I warn every new hire that I will deal in the reality of ministry, that I tell them the truth. It's up to them to deal with it. Sometimes we are our own worst enemy in that we don't want to see what's really there or admit that we need help. Pursue friends. Be intentional. Don't sit alone and sulk. He puts in parentheses, I've done that. It doesn't really help. Find another leader you enjoy and spend time with them. And I'm going to say, be open and honest with them. Don't just spend time with them. Pace yourself. Take a regular day off. When you sense impatience or irritation, schedule downtime. This is long-term care. We are human beings in need of rest and recreation. And then he says, grow. Conferences. Learn, connect, and grow. Unburden yourselves and learn from one another. And I'm going to end with his last words, and he says, I don't have all the answers for burnout. I wrestle with the same pressures you do. What I do have is a commitment to finish well, and I'll pay the price to do that by God's grace. And I think he says it well, is if our goal is to finish well and to do the work we've been given, we're not going to do it if we take ourselves and bury ourselves in the ground and let the day-to-day take us out. And so burnout and fatigue, common. The problem is not if we experience it. The problem happens when we ignore it and don't feed ourselves, slow down, and regroup and take time to be fed, get back in directions, and seek the Lord's direction through that season of our lives. This too shall end. And we don't know what's on the other side. So this is a good time to say, Lord, what are you preparing us for then that we need to learn and put into practice now? Because there's something else besides COVID around the corner that the enemy will use to take us out. So as Jesus says, come learn, walk with me, grow with me, and I will show you the unforced rhythm of grace. I pray for each of you. I know that it is a tough, tough season out there. I know it is here. We are different, but we are still all in ministry and dealing with the ever-changing world around us. So thank you. Apparently it is taped, so you can spread the word if you want to. Okay, thank you.